Hello, everyone. My name is Celeste Warren. I am founder of Celeste Warren Consulting. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a Black female. And I am so glad that you all are joining us for this conversation between myself and my longtime friend, mentor, colleague, Deb Dagit. Deb, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Celeste. It's great to be with you today. I'm Deb Dagit. I identify as a white female. My pronouns are she and her. And I'm also a person with apparent and non-apparent disabilities. I'm 4 feet tall and use mobility aids, and I have a hearing aid and a service dog. So sometimes that's TMI, but for the purposes of some of the things we're going to talk about today, I'll include that information, and I'm looking forward to today's conversation.
Thank you, Deb. We have talked about this since I met you back in 2002. And I remember it because I was coming back from maternity leave with my first child, my daughter Christina. And you reached out to me. You had just started working at Merck, and you reached out to me to work on a powerful something that I remember to this day, over 20 something years later, the organizational fitness profiling, the work that we did there, and it was so powerful. And you as a chief diversity officer, myself as a chief diversity officer, we wanted to have this conversation and have it in a live stream because we've been having it for decades, and we thought that we know that there are chief diversity officers and those that are leaders in this industry that are having these conversations too. So we thought, you know what? Why don't we share this conversation that we've been having for decades with others? And it's just to talk a little bit about, honestly and candidly and courageously, about the role of the chief diversity officer, how it's transitioned over the years, over your career, Deb, my career, and just some advice that we like to end it and close out the conversation with at the end. So we'll go ahead and get started. Um, how did you see the Chief Diversity Officer role start, and how was it positioned when you first became a CDO, Deb?
Well, that was way back in the early 90s. And at the time, it was really seen as a transition to move away from compliance, affirmative action, and equal employment opportunity towards a more systemic way of approaching all of the processes, not only in human resources and how we treat talent, from the time we're first sourcing through retirement, but also the business. How are we approaching our customers? And it was interesting because at the beginning, there wasn't a lot of resistance. Anyone who objected to it thought, oh, this too shall pass. It'll be, one of the flavors of the month, and we'll just wait it out. And others were curious about it. And in the early days, we had affinity networks. That was the language that was used. And they were kind of allowed, and this was in the tech sector. That's an important caveat. I started my career out in Silicon Valley. So the first decade or so of this work was in a place where in California you could experiment. And the grassroots teams were coming up with really innovative ideas to find and onboard talent, to retain and develop people, and also to address our customers. And the youthful CEOs and that part of the economy, a lot of the people running companies were earlier in their journey. They thought it was kind of cool. And they thought, well, this will get me more federal contracts because it does help with AAEEO. So if I'm audited or going after a contract, we look good. And it's kind of interesting. So that was what it was like. And it was kind of a wild, wild west. And the only thing that kept it tame was there was enough money in the system that we had a lot of very skilled PhD level organizational development consultants. And so they took the work and really looked at it strategically and systemically. They were amazing partners. It wasn't just food and fun, it was really about how do we help the business.
Yes, yes. I remember when I was meeting you and you were telling me all the stories about Silicon Valley and what it was like. And it seemed like it was just exciting too, and such a journey. I can remember when I started in 2014, I was having a conversation with with a colleague. It was probably about three or 2 years ago. And he was talking about how, Celeste, you were a CDO during such a tumultuous time. We had xenophobia, we had homophobia, and all of the racism, the sexism, but through Me Too, through um, the murders of Trayvon Martin, and all of the different people that the violence that occurred, and then also the pandemic, and the murder of George Floyd, and then the conservatism that followed. So it was ups and down. It was certainly a roller coaster during my time, and perseverance and resilience was probably core to what helped me to just be able to keep pushing forward during that time.
Yeah, I get it. It can feel like you're the victim of being a dodgeball, like you're in the center and everyone's throwing balls at you. And you're trying not to get too injured in the process of doing your job. When I first moved from California to the Northeast and from the sector that was technology oriented to pharmaceuticals, that period of time was when there was a lot of catch up going on. So I felt like I had stepped back in time. So we had made all this progress in diversity, and the leaders were on board, and we had these really powerful employee resource groups that were helping the business. And I get to the East Coast, and we're still talking about homosexuals and Orientals. And I literally, I remember my first few, months as being kind of in a state of shock that within the same country, I kept saying to people, I think it would have been easier to go to Japan and try to do this because this just isn't what I expected. And then people tried to convince me that diversity was the difference between Italians and Irish. And I wasn't doing enough to support the bias against people from different European countries. And I learned that there were enclaves of people living together by that cultural background, which, not to say I didn't value that and think it was cool in its own way, but to say that people who have a different European experience are having the same challenges as someone who identifies as LGBTQ plus or a person of color or someone with a disability just defied, reason and rationality. But eventually we figured out a strategy around that, which I always say to other diversity leaders, you want to go back to what's in service of the business to stop the noise. And I know that's your approach too, Celeste. So, in my case, in my time, it was creating a culture where it's safe for everybody to speak up. You could not have innovation. You could not get products to market. You could not solve manufacturing problems if people were afraid to say what they knew or to challenge someone more senior or traditional ways of doing things. And through that door, we could address the needs of all the different communities that were underserved or underutilized. What was your experience like?
Oh yeah, you talk about the dodgeball. You feel like you're the spoke in the wheel. You know, it became really, really just critical for me to keep making sure that, as you said, you're thinking about the business and how that impacts what you're doing from a diversity, equity, and inclusion standpoint. And I felt like, okay, I have to make sure that the C-suite leaders understand the role that they're supposed to play, that they understand the important role because of the shadow of the leader, and making sure that they're role modeling inclusive leadership behaviors and all of the things that they need to be doing. And then there's the leaders that I call, they may not have a span of control, direct reports, but they have a span of influence, a sphere of influence, where they're the people who, when some message comes down from on high, that their peers and the people in the organization turn to them and say, well, I know this VP said this. What do you think? And they listen to them. And so to me, those were my ambassadors and the change agents in the organization who had that respect, and making sure that I was continually conversing with them. Some of them were employee business resource group leaders. Some of them were were just people that had influence within the organization that people respected. And then you had people who were in the different parts of the organization that, a lot of times organizations, depending on whether you're in manufacturing or research or commercial marketing, et cetera, you have different priorities, that are serving the ultimate organizational priority, but the way that you approach it is so very different that sometimes it feels like there's silos. And so trying to make sure that you're trying to get and understand all of those different things and bring them together to say, we have one purpose, and that is about, you need to be able to speak up, you need to be able to speak and elevate your voice, you need to make sure that our employees feel empowered, engaged, and valued for what they bring to the table. And that was, people say, well, you had your good days, your bad days. I think, Deb, I had my good hours. In each day, there were good hours and bad hours. And that's, kind of how you had to do it. And regardless of how you were feeling, you had to make sure that you couldn't I didn't feel I could project how I was feeling in who I was talking to, what I was doing, because you had the responsibility of speaking for tens of thousands of employees, and sort of, making sure that you're doing that. But another layer that makes this role unique is that for many leaders, this isn't just professional, it's personal for us,
Yeah.
especially you and I. How has your lived experience shown up as a strength for you in this role?
When I first started, I thought I needed to do what my parents and teachers and others had taught me, which is, if I pretend like I'm not different, then others will see me as more of a leader, will be more comfortable with me, will see me as more competent. And then I had a wonderful mentor named Dr. Price Cobbs, who wrote some amazing books about cracking the corporate code, and many others. And he said, Deb, if you don't share your lived experience and the, challenges that go along with that, it will be harder for you to gain the confidence of people who've had different lived experience. And so some of the challenges that you face may have come about for a different reason, but had a similar impact. The other thing, and you started to see this come out in TED Talks maybe a decade or so later, is that vulnerability is a strength. And so, if you think about doing the diversity work as, let's say you're trying to get a big fence painted around a large property and you want everyone to grab a bucket and a paintbrush. You need to say you need help. And oh, by the way, this is fun. So I learned that with my lived experience as a little person with disabilities, which was patently obvious First of all, male leaders, especially, all wanted to help me. So, first, I would give them something to do that helped me personally, and incrementally, then it would be helping the ERG, then it would be helping with a specific initiative, then it would be joining a diversity council. And I realized that that was a good way to build rapport. And as they got to know me as a person, to make it fun and to show them this isn't going to be a drag. This is going to have a positive, not a negative effect on your leadership skills, how your employees and your peers feel about you, how you're viewed outside the company. It's going to build your confidence and competence in ways that you can't imagine. And as that happened more and more in my career, people saw that by being involved in the work that we were doing, it did, in fact, burnish people's individual career as well as the overall company. But I had to lean into, instead of saying, oh, I'm so strong and independent and I don't need any help. Yes, come help me. And eventually that led to getting a lot of good stuff done. But well, I'll bet the experience was similar, but also a little different for you.
Yeah, Deb, when I first got in the role, I felt for whatever reason that I had to put my blackness to in the background because I was listening to the rhetoric, which wasn't healthy for me, but I was listening to this inside voice and what I perceived whispers down the lane about me was, oh, well, she's black. And of course, she's going to be wanting to do stuff for the African American or those employees of African descent. And it's self serving for her. And so, for like a month or two, when I first got in the role, I was, trying to act like well, I'm just going to do this role and I'm going to do it in a way that people don't automatically see me as a black woman coming into the room, but they see me as a leader. And that lasted just a couple of months because I had a conversation with myself, and a very candid conversation and hard conversation. And I said, what are you doing? You're supposed to be speaking for all employees, all identities around the world. And if you eliminate speaking about those of African descent because you feel this way, that it's going to be self-serving, then you're not speaking for everyone. You're not being inclusive. You're not doing your job. And so I quickly put that away. And I had, some people, whispering in the water coolers talking about how, of course, she's going to want to do things for the League of Employees of African Descent. And it's like, I want to do things for all employees. And I'm going to make sure that I am doing things for all employees, regardless of whether you think I'm being self-serving or not. So I had to have that candid conversation with myself and put that aside and do the job the best way that I knew how to do it, representing the voices of all the employees. Because oh my goodness, what a disservice I would have been doing if I had continued in that vein and listened to this self-doubting talk, because I wanted to do the job so well and didn't want anything to get in the way of it. But it wasn't, I was getting in my own way as opposed to making sure that I was listening to the voices of all of our employees. And so I'm glad that I had that talk with myself and change things around. And you have to be courageous. You have to make sure that people don't sort of do that Jedi mind trick with you, because they can, in a heartbeat, try to devalue you as a person. And when they do that, they're devaluing the work that you're doing, and it causes you to not do the work to the best of your ability. Now, we fast forward to today's environment with everything that's been happening, especially in the United States, in today's environment, the political, social, economic environment, with increased legal considerations and some of the internal hesitancy or pullback or rollback that some organizations are doing. And I say some organizations, what's important to hold on to from your point of view, Deb, even as tactics and diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, they evolve?
Well, first of all, we have to separate what's perceived versus what's real. Executive orders are not laws, and we're overcorrecting before we have to. So there's, really reminding yourself that legal counsel is gonna advise on the lowest possible risk profile, and you need to push back when it's not reasonable. The second thing is we've always, I can promise you, as long as I've been doing anything in this space, have done what I used to call guerrilla diversity. And that doesn't mean you're not doing the work authentically and really leaning in. But here is what's true. When you're doing this work, you are implementing systemic change in leadership development, call it that, in talent management, in every single aspect of how you think about your employees and, oh, by the way, your customers, how you approach the consumer base with your products and services, how you make your packaging work for everybody who needs to access your products. And so instead of labeling the work that you're doing with something that has undeservedly become toxic, just call the work what it is. And with your employees, your grassroots teams, make that transparent. Like, here is evidence that you can see that's real, that we're still doing this work and that we're no less committed. In fact, we're redoubling our efforts. But if you don't hear us making headlines using the words that have been selected by certain people in authority to be the opposite of what they are, that doesn't mean we don't care. Now, I've seen both, heck no, we're just going to say the language the way we always do work. And that works if your HR leadership and your executive leadership, including your CEO, are on board with that. But if they've been convinced that that is a risk, that doesn't mean you stop all engines. You still go after the work and use the words that are still true, but no longer have that energy, that radioactivity associated with them. Celeste, I know as a proud alumni that we came from an organization that did not back down, and that worked because I believe, at least in part, it was because you did have the support of the top of the organization.
Yeah, I was blessed, Deb, and I stand on the shoulders of people like you that did such a strong work in diversity, equity, inclusion at the company. But I I when all of this started happening, and it didn't just start happening in 2025, it was building after that, because we know that it was just building. Just you started to just see this sort of slow crescendo, starting with Roe v. Wade and other things as well. And it really, when you think about the work that we have been doing, at first it was kind of like, wow, it's almost like a personal attack on me and my colleagues that have been in this industry and been doing this work. Whether you're a CDO or you're just someone who was demonstrating inclusive leadership and an ambassador and a change agent for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what I always like to say with folks is that people say, well, we've done away with diversity, equity, inclusion. It's like you can't do away with it because diversity is simply the differences in people, those you can see and those you can't see. Unless you're just going to get rid of people, you can't get rid of the diversity that exists within people. You want inclusive environments because you have to get all of those people with all of those different differences, whether that be skills, capabilities, identities, life experience, cultural differences to a collective purpose. And that collective purpose is like the mission or the vision of your organization. How are you going to get all of those different people to that collective purpose? You have to surround them with a culture of inclusion, engagement, empowerment so they can do that. You have to then do acts of equity, meeting them where they are, because they all came from different starting points, and put those acts of equity in place to get them to that collective purpose. In your business, as you said, marketing 101 is understanding your customers, understanding and segmenting them, studying them, understanding why your products, your services, whatever it is that you provide seems to be working with one identity of customers and not with another. And you study that and you understand it. That's marketing 101. It's business 101. And so I just laugh sometimes because to keep from crying in this environment, but I laugh because it's like you don't even know the essence of what you're talking about because this is fundamental, it's foundational. And I truly believe that CEOs understand that and they know that. They understand that it's leadership 101, management 101, business 101. The shareholders certainly understand it because we keep seeing the reports of shareholders voting down all of these anti-DE&I proposals that are coming in at companies. So we know that it's there, and the customers certainly are paying attention, and they're voting with their pocketbooks and their wallets. So it's something for me that when it was initially starting to unfold, I was really disheartened. But then we pick ourselves up and we say, what are we talking about? This work will never ever go away. And then all of the legal challenges, it's if you that this you stay, we've always stayed in the law because the legal aspect of it is the civil rights movement. It's titled, it's like, why are people continuing to say illegal DE&I? Because if you were a chief diversity officer with your grain and with any grain of salt and knew about it, knew the essence of it, you knew that you had to make sure that you didn't discriminate based on race and sexual orientation and disability and all of these different things, gender. That's the law. And you have to make sure that you're not doing that. And any of us that knew, we didn't create diversity and inclusion strategies to say we want to exclude a certain groups of people because we only want to focus here. That's not the definition of inclusion. So, it's so hilarious when I hear that, oh, we've done away with DE&I, and it's just, no, you haven't. The work will always continue. As long as there are people in this world, in organizations, in universities, in nonprofits, in society, we will always be doing this work. And like you said, you can call it whatever, you're still always going to be doing this work. Now, we want to make sure that we leave people with a sense of hope and inspiration for those that are doing this work on a day-to-day basis. What are some practical guidance that you can give today's chief diversity officers, Deb?
Yes, whatever they're calling you these days, right?
Yes.
So, first of all, focus on what's practical and doable, not Hail Marys. This is not a time for a Hail Mary, although that's a great movie. Remember, progress comes overnight, not overnight, but over time, and you cannot shorten it into quarterly results. You have to have a longer horizon and make the business case that that's important. You want to forge alliances of mutual benefit. You know, work across all of the intersections and see how far can you skip that stone in order to get good stuff done. Remember, leaders can be found at all levels, and leadership is situational. Do not just look up as high as you can for who can help. Of course, as they say, put on your own oxygen mask first. If you're really exhausted and burnt out, take care of that and then come back to it. Um, please recognize and name gaslighting and other strategies to push you off track. Don't pretend like it doesn't hurt or you didn't notice it. Name it and move on. Continuously learn. You know, you don't have to get totally infatuated with AI, but know how it works. And use it when it's to your benefit. This is an important one. Own your mistakes, but don't dwell on them. You're often having to break new ground and pilot things. But also own and celebrate your successes. Too often we move on. Perfection is the enemy of progress, so give yourself grace. Something I learned from my stepfather, who was a lineman for an electric company and built lots of houses: barter and trade for help. You have knowledge, information, and resources that someone else wants that they can help you. And this is especially true in the disability work around accessibility and working with the IT and facilities function. If you're an OG, and I don't think you're one yet, Celeste, but I know I am, embrace it with pride. And if you are on a learning curve, find OGs to accelerate your learning and remind you that while, yes, this work is tough and sometimes requires a great deal of courage and a thick skin, it is personally and professionally often a calling, and it feeds and fills your intellect, your soul with human kindness, fortitude, and dare I say it, love.
Mm.
So hopefully that didn't sound too Pollyannish, but those are my final words. What about you, Celeste? What are your words of wisdom?
Everything that you said, it was wonderful. And then I'll just close it out with three things. I like to say my three stays. First is stay relevant. And just, piggybacking on what you said, make sure as a chief diversity officer, as a leader in this space of diversity and inclusion, that you're staying relevant around not just what's going on within your organization, but also externally, what's happening in the political environment, what's happening in the social environment, what's happening in the economic environment. Make sure that you're staying relevant and you understand all of these different things that are happening because it impacts you in the work that you're doing. The second thing is stay supportive of each other. Reach out to your colleagues. Just, sometimes if you just send a text or give them a call or take a break out of the day, if you're having a tough day, take a break, reach out to someone and get a lifeline, because this work is hard. It is not for the faint of heart. And you need the support of colleagues that know what you're going through, that are going through the same thing, and that you can help each other. And then the last thing I think I'll say is just stay in the fight, because we need everybody to get in the boat, grab an oar, and row. We need everybody to contribute to helping us to create cultures within organizations, within society, that we all want to see and we all want to be a part of. And I think that's just really, really important. I know there are days when you want to say, oh God, I just want to give up. It's not worth it. I know there are lots of days like that, but stay in the fight, because we need you. We need you. Our children need you. Our grandchildren will need you, because we want to create the world where they don't have to go through what we went through. So, Deb, I want to say thank you for taking the time to have this conversation with me. Like I said at the beginning, you and I have been talking about this since day one that I met you. and you've been talking with others in the role that you play now, and talking and counseling and coaching others as well. And I just want to say thank you for how you've coached and counseled and mentored me throughout my period, and others as well. Thanks to all of you all as well for listening in on our conversation. We hope that it was a conversation that you wanted to hear, that you needed to hear, and it inspired you in just some way, and you're taking something from it that you can use when you go back to your office or to the work that you do. Thank you again for listening to us, this conversation with Deb Daggett and Celeste Warren. And take care and have a good rest of your week.